Hello and thanks for joining us at interest.co.nz. I'm Jenee Tibshraeny and today I'm joined by the Climate Change Commission Chair, Dr. Carr. Thanks for your time, Rod.
Kia ora, Jenee.
The Climate Change Commission has released a major report detailing draft proposals for what New Zealand needs to do to reach the government's climate targets. Yep. Now, you've released 3 budgets that sort of progressively say what we need to do out till 2035. And I mean, basically, we're talking about a range of things across a number of sectors, from sort of reducing cow numbers, boosting the uptake of EVs, getting rid of coal, moving away from the justification that we can just keep living our lives normally but planting trees. Now, the report is clear that the whole economy needs to change, and that's what I'd like to talk about today, but also that the costs won't fall evenly across everyone.
Yeah.
Rod, I heard you describe the shift that needs to happen as being akin, if not sort of more seismic, than the economic shifts that New Zealand had in the 80s. Could you just give us an idea of the magnitude of change that needs to occur?
So we try and understand how economic activity is measured through GDP, but we also know that GDP doesn't capture everything. But in terms of GDP, we think about 1% of GDP might have to be invested in the transition to decarbonise essentially our transport and electricity generation systems, and to move agriculture onto a pathway for reduced biogenic methane emissions. So about 1% of GDP. In our report, we say in the first 3 budget periods out to 2035, that economic growth is going to occur. The New Zealand economy is expected to grow to about a $400 billion economy. But it would have grown by about 1% more each year if we hadn't invested in the transition. So there are real costs as measured by GDP. But we do not estimate the co-benefits of that move in terms of a cleaner, greener, healthier, more sustainable society. And we do not estimate the costs if we don't move. And by 2035, we find ourselves in essentially a dirty, low-tech trajectory, where we begin to be excluded from the markets we might want access to, and we haven't got the technical capabilities to use and deploy the new technologies that have become available.
Sure, now I'd like to flesh some of those comments out throughout this interview, but to look at the GDP figure first, 1% doesn't sound like much, but at the moment that would be $3.2 billion, roughly, is that?
That's true, and we actually do the sum, and we say it's $34 billion between now and 2035.
So at the moment, when we have GDP growth, it might be 2%, it might be 3% if it's good. So you're saying this would mean that instead of having 3% growth, for example, we'd have 2%
Correct.
growth. Right. In terms of the way GDP translates to the government's tax take, that's an interesting dynamic I'd like to talk about, because GDP growth usually equates to a higher tax take by the government, and these policies that will be required to make this transition will cost. And so we have less tax coming in, and we have the government presumably needing to spend more on public transport, on rail, on, I don't know, some sort of subsidies, that type of thing. Do you think the way we think about government debt also needs to evolve?
Well, it's evolved pretty rapidly in the last little while, where we've essentially created almost unlimited access to credit in the Western world. But coming back to the more fundamental question, you're right, because GDP is a measure of monetized busyness in our economy, it is a proxy for what is taxable, because it's turned into money and traded, and therefore it's transparent and visible to a government that can levy taxes on it. Governments find it harder to levy taxes on bad things that aren't traded in the economy, like pollution. It's hard to tax pollution until you put a price on it and require people to pay for it. So you're right to think that there are some things we value highly that are not in GDP, and there are some bad things which, if they were in GDP and we could measure and tax them, we might do less of them. So GDP is just a measure at a point in time of things we choose to value and trade.
In terms of the way we look at government debt and we try to keep it low, I mean, ideally below 30% sort of net core crown debt as a percentage of GDP, the target that Treasury uses is at least below 30%. you know, is that realistic to keep using that model when realistically we need a lot of investment to get to these targets?
Well, I do think we have to keep in mind the fact that when we borrow money, we, this generation, us today, borrow money, even if we never repaid it, and I suspect a lot of what's been borrowed is never going to get repaid, it is still going to stop a future generation from borrowing that money. There is an opportunity cost that we've taken a block of available credit from the future and used it now. So we need to make sure we're using it wisely, because the future generation may never repay that debt, but they're not going to be able to borrow as much again. So if we use the debt to finance things a future generation will get value from, like a healthier, cleaner, greener, more sustainable future, then they will inherit the debt and a better world. If we borrow the money to prop up old types of technology and business practices that they are going to need to abandon in the future, then they will inherit the debt as well as the need to adopt those better low emission strategies in the future. That's not fair.
In terms of, I'd just like to get a bit more perspective on what you've proposed in this draft piece of advice. How does this compare to what other OECD countries are looking at doing? Is it more ambitious, on par, or less ambitious?
Well, what we see is some OECD countries, like the UK, have moved earlier, like 10 years ahead of us, and had other opportunities to reduce their emissions. They've switched out coal-fired power stations in favour of nuclear power and wind. Some other countries have been able to switch out other high emissions technologies in favour of low emissions, such as the nuclear power option, or some have gone from coal to gas. Now, in New Zealand's case, we have to look at our own emissions profile and think about, well, what for us are the opportunities to get the lower cost to reduce emissions?
This advice has received a whole lot of commentary,
As
praise,
it should.
criticism, so on, as it should. One of the comments that was made was by the country's oil and gas lobby group, PEPANS, and they said we need to travel at a similar pace to other countries, given we are a technology follower and price taker. If we try to move too fast ahead, we'll make the transition more expensive and painful, and risk delivering perverse outcomes. What do you make of that critique that I believe might be a widely held one?
Yeah, so the starting point is we do need to focus on transition technologies that have end dates. And the gas industry has quite appropriately argued that they can be a transition technology. Fine, sign up for the date by which you're gone. Otherwise, you are just using transition to a perpetual state. Secondly, if we are in a transition to an end date, we need to not invest in new pipes in the ground. We need to stop doing that so that we don't have stranded assets and our infrastructure can reach the end of its economic life. And in addition to that, if that sector can develop carbon capture and storage technology and deploy it at the point of combustion, then do it.
Sure.
Don't talk about it, show us.
And the Commission has said, just to continue down this oil and gas side of things, that gas is useful in the transition, but as you said before, there needs to be an end point.
Yeah, and we even have some gas in 2050 in our modelling.
Yeah, okay.
By the way, it's natural gas that's the issue. It's the fossil fuel gas. If we can substitute biogas, that's cool.
Okay. Look, we'll come back to some of the details of the different sectors, but I just want to ask another question on a high level. You know, while we've talked about GDP and the costs of this, it is also important to look at the counterfactual. What would the economic cost be if we don't move? And I think that's something that needs to be talked about as well. When it comes to trade agreements and the Paris Agreement and that sort of thing, you know, the public, we look at these things and we think, what does this even mean? But what would it actually mean if New Zealand didn't meet its targets according to these agreements that we have with other countries?
So there's a couple of things. First of all, under the Paris Agreement, each country was invited to set its own nationally determined contribution. It wasn't imposed by some superior body on New Zealand. We got to choose, and we set our first nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. Under that agreement, you are also obliged to review and reset and potentially ratchet down your emissions as new technologies become available, and we put ourselves on a path, which we are not on as the world today, to only less than 2 degrees, potentially 1.5 degrees warming. We're on a 3+ degree pathway as humanity is doing its business today. So the nationally determined contribution is what do nations each agree they should do and hold each other accountable for. You then can achieve that by domestic action, reducing your own gross emissions or removals from forestry, and to the extent that your own domestic action doesn't get you to your nationally determined contribution, then you're up for offshore mitigation. In other words, if you can't or choose not to do the domestic action, then pay some other country who is better placed to achieve those emissions than you are. And that's what we call offshore mitigation. Now, quantifying that in terms of a financial cost is difficult. So what we say is we think the government every year should give an estimate of the risk and the cost, given what we know at the time, about what our offshore mitigation is likely to be and what it will cost. So we think that transparency is important, but at the moment it's hard to quantify. So we provide some numbers, but they're all arithmetic. If you assume a shortfall of X million tonnes and you assume a global price of Y, well, X times Y tells you what the number is. And we've got numbers anywhere from $2 billion to over $10 billion for the potential cost in 2030 of our nationally determined contribution, given our domestic action.
In terms of trade and selling our products, I mean, would it be a thing where in the future, say we are still quite dirty but we happen to have really tasty meat, that a country says, oh well, that's fine, your meat is really good, it's good quality, we'll take the meat, never mind the fact that you're quite dirty? Or do you think they'll go, well, we want the meat if it's good, but you're actually quite dirty too, so no thank you?
Yeah, well, I think several things. I think several things are going to happen. I think consumer preferences are going to play out here as well. So some of it will be about what regulators in foreign markets might do, but some of it will be about what consumers, particular middle income and upper middle income, which are our target market for our premium products, what will they choose to do will drive some of this. Secondly, there will be regulators in place. So if Europe imposes emissions reduction programs and costs on their domestic producers, they're not going to allow the high emitting embodied products and services to be delivered into that market. So market access is going to be an issue. And we've also got the evolution of new technologies, that if we're not on the curve and understanding and applying the new technologies, then we will simply become less relevant as new low emissions ways of producing proteins become available on the planet. So get on the path, stay on the path, learn what others are doing, we wouldn't want to get ahead, certainly is an argument we need to understand. New Zealand didn't develop refrigeration, but we were an early adopter and a huge beneficiary when we figured out how to freeze meat and get it to Europe.
With agriculture, one of the sort of key recommendations is decrease livestock numbers by 15% within the next 9 years. But
we have to be a bit careful about that. We don't set a target for livestock numbers as such.
Right.
What we say is there's land use change occurring because of the forestry. There's changes which are going to occur because of the feeding and breeding practices which we already know exist that will become more widely adopted. And we say that there will be emissions pricing as a result of the He-Waka-Eke-Noa partnership discussions. As a consequence, if you hold meat and milk production roughly constant, then you can get that output with 15% less sheep and cows.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, and I mean, for someone like myself who's not a technical expert in this area, how does that work? How do you cut the number of animals but keep the production the same? So
10 years ago, they started doing some research on sheep. Is can you breed for the trait of low methane emissions, biogenic methane emissions from sheep, while maintaining lambing rates and meat production? Turns out you can, right? Same way you can breed sheep for twinning. So the sheep farmers know how to pick animals for traits that are desirable. And as a consequence, that's a known technology, and now the science is there to prove that you can breed. It takes time to breed through the flock, and what we're saying is get on and do it. there's about a 10% reduction in methane from sheep meat production if you breed for the trait.
Right.
We're only just beginning to do similar research on dairy cows, but there's no reason to believe, with the right research accelerated, that you shouldn't be able to get it. So we're recommending the government needs to fund the support of that research and needs to help farmers become knowledgeable and adopt the better practices which are already evident in some New Zealand farms.
Okay, so key role for the government, so the cost doesn't fall entirely on
Correct.
on the agricultural sector. Okay, just moving on to, I know this is a very high level overview, but moving on to energy, a key recommendation is a greater reliance on wind, especially when it comes to electricity generation. Now this clearly would require a whole bunch of new turbines being put up. A lot has been consented. To what extent do you think uncertainty around Tiwai Point and its closure has actually stymied development in this area, where companies are thinking, hold on, we'll just hold fire for a moment to see what happens to Tiwai?
And that's a response some of the generators have given us, is until they know what's happening to that, they don't know whether to progress or hold off developing new renewables, and that's legitimate. So we do need to resolve, and we have assumptions, but that's all they are, about what happens. So our modelling assumes Tiwai closes, but it also assumes that that electricity is made available for all New Zealanders to decarbonise, particularly ground transport and low and medium temperature process heat. So we assume that. If that doesn't happen, then a set of other assumptions would need to come into play. But if that does happen, then wholesale electricity prices fall for a time, and that excess is absorbed into the market, helps accelerate the uptake of electrification. But by 2035, we think the real price of electricity looks pretty much like it does today, and we need to have increased renewable generation by 170%. So we need to build new stuff anyway.
Yeah. Okay, going on to transport, uptake of EVs is something we'll inevitably need to move quicker towards. Do you support a fee-based scheme, as was the one proposed under the previous
We've said it
government?
needs to be investigated, but there may be other policy interventions that change relative pricing. And we also suggest you look at the tax system. The taxpayers are allowed to deduct the cost of buying, owning and operating an ICE. Well, maybe the government shouldn't be providing that level of subsidy. Maybe just simply saying, if you want to buy one, that's fine, but it's not tax deductible in your business. We don't recommend that. We say look into such ways of providing relative price incentives.
Okay. Dr. Rod Carr, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. And I'm Jenee Tibshraeny from interest.co.nz.